Beneath the shadow of the Brooklyn Bridge stands an unassuming wood-framed Georgian-style building that gently lifts to one side, whose red clapboard exterior exposes a swollen underbelly twisted with age. Passing its antiquated silhouette, many merely view it as nothing more than a feeble relic that progress has left in its wake. But to do so would deprive one a glimpse into a colorful past that almost belies description. For unbeknownst to most who pass within its shadow, this slumbering sentinel conceals a great many dark secrets within its now silent walls, dwarfed by an ever-growing skyline. Its determination to withstand the ravages time has wrought upon its tired bones is nothing short of remarkable. This is the story of the Bridge Cafe. The Bridge Cafe has stood on the corner of Water and Dover Streets for more than 2 centuries and is the oldest wood-frame structure in New York City. It is also the oldest drinking establishment and the oldest business within the city, eclipsing Chase Manhattan by 5 years. It is easy to imagine the assemblage of disreputable tales that may have occurred within the walls of any 200-year-old drinking establishment set amidst a bustling seaport. Least of all, one that sits smack in the heart of the city's most disorderly neighborhoods, the Fourth Ward, home to Herbert Asbury's The Gangs of New York. To properly set the stage for the Bridge Cafe's dark history, we must venture back to the year 1794. Many say this was the year the wood frame structure at 279 Water Street was built, but in truth, most scholars are uncertain. Some say it was erected even earlier. What is for certain is that 1794 was the year that Newell Noreen leased a building from James Kipp for the purpose of running a grocery and a wine bottler business on the ground floor, while most likely living on the floor above. The structure bore little resemblance to what we see today. It was originally 2.5 stories with a peaked roof and was tucked between the many brick homes built by seafaring captains that lined Water Street during the latter part of the 18th century. The seaport itself also looked far different than its modern-day counterpart, for we are speaking of time before massive landfill projects dramatically altered the island's topography, expanding the landmass of Lower Manhattan at the expense of the East River. Barely a half block to the east of Water Street was the site of Lawrence's Wharf. To put that into perspective, the wharf occupied the approximate location of the Bridge Cafe's modern-day kitchen, and the river itself lapped against the structure's foundation. The structure's colorful history began in earnest a mere 2 years later when Noreen was shuffled off to debtor's prison. This in turn led Kipp to lease the premises to a retired ship captain named Peter Lang and his wife Janet. The Langs were God-fearing folk of honorable means who purchased the building outright in 1801 with the intentions of operating solely the grocery portion of the former tenant's operation, and did so for the next 25 years. But sometimes piousness comes with a price. The area began a steady denigration from a place of stately maritime residences to that of a haven for carousing seafarers, thieves, smugglers, and hooligans of all varieties. Questionable businesses began dotting the landscape for the supreme purpose of emptying the pockets of the ruffians who frequented these adulterine establishments. Trying to run an honest and decent business in this chaotic atmosphere proved a daunting task for the Langs. Managing to hold on until 1826, they sold the building to a New York attorney named Charles Goads by Ferris. And with the sale, so began the site's steady decline into infamy. The 1840s through the Civil War were years that saw great changes sweep the lower portion of Manhattan, and many not necessarily for the better. Political corruption abounded at City Hall, and life for the lower class was one of immeasurable strife. Crime was rampant, while begging and pilfering were almost looked upon as semi-honest forms of employment. For denizens of the city's Fourth Ward, it was an era of rapid degeneration. In 279, Water Street fell right in line with the immorality and depravity that consumed the neighborhood. The once stately brick homes that lined Water Street and graced the seaport with some modicum of elegance had since been converted into a bevy of gambling houses, brothels, saloons, and flop houses. For his part, Ferris didn't seem too alarmed at the neighborhood's rapid decline, and those that rented his property were free to engage in any form of business they desired as long as the rent was paid. But perhaps the leaseholder of most consequence, who all but single-handedly cemented 279 Water Street's place in history, was Henry Williams, who in 1847 opened a porterhouse and began an unbroken record as New York's oldest drinking establishment, narrowly surpassing McSorley's Old Ale House by about 7 years. But strong drink was not all Williams was offering his rowdy clientele. For the next 13 years, his establishment doubled as a brothel. For according to the 1860 New York City census, 6 Irish prostitutes lived on the second floor of 279 Water Street while plying their trade in the saloon below. And if that wasn't enough, Ferris chose to lease the rear room of the building, whose address was then known as 16 Dover Street. His tenant was James McGinnis, who aspired to run a porterhouse of his own. And this is where the story gets a bit convoluted while providing more than a little food for thought. You see, it seems that in Herbert Asbury's 1927 book, The Gangs of New York, there was a reference made in regards to a particularly vicious dive named the Hole in the Wall that stood at the corner of Water and Dover Streets until 1855. Could it be possible that Asbury's infamous Hole in the Wall and the establishments of Williams and McGinnis be one and the same? Many seem to think so, particularly since there are more than a few coincidences in both timeline and lore, fiction and reality. And if this is indeed the case, then the site has also been home to one of history's most frightening figures, Gallas Mag. If descriptions are accurate, Gallas Mag was one of the most infamous bouncers New York has ever seen. An Englishwoman standing over 6 feet in height, it's reputed she strolled the premises with a gun tucked in her belt and a club strapped to her wrist. She had a fearsome reputation that typically was enough to keep troublemakers at bay. However, if one chose to chance her wrath, it is said she'd willingly oblige by bludgeoning their skull, grasping an ear between her teeth, and escorting the violator to the door. If the scoundrel was brazen enough to show resistance, she'd happily bite the miscreant's ear off and store it in a jar behind the bar that she utilized as something of a macabre trophy case. No one was beyond Mag's wrath when her ire was raised, and that included the authorities. Gallas Mag was deemed by New York police as the most savage female they had ever encountered. That speaks volumes considering the element of cutthroats that roamed the waterfront during the mid to late 19th century. As a side note to paranormal enthusiasts, her spirit is said to roam the premises to this very day. As Williams and McGinnis's leases ended, records show John Henry Stelling and William Brosnan sold liquor from the premises. However, their enterprise proved to be short-lived. As of 1859, Thomas Norton was shown to hold the lease, and if Gallas Mag wasn't enough to do so, then events under Norton's watch would prove to cement 279 Water Street's place in the annals of notoriety. By all accounts, Norton's establishment was one that exceeded even that of the already low standards that permeated everyday life on the waterfront. To add insult to injury, it was all too apparent that he was adverse to no form of deprivation or corruption as long as it continued to line his pockets. Any act of immorality that could possibly have occurred within the premises of his establishment did indeed take place, including murder. The fatal encounter began early in 1862 when an attractive 28-year-old woman named Catherine Curran had become involved in a dissolute relationship with a man named James Winthrop. The liaison must have proved far more meaningful to Catherine than it did Winthrop, for when he tired of having his way with her, he simply cast her aside and took up with another woman named Honora Morrissey. The parting had proven unbearable for the distraught Curran, and she tenaciously begged her former lover to reconsider and take her back. Following numerous appeals that proved futile, her desperation manifested in the way of stalking the object of her affections. Tiring of the game, Winthrop conspired with Morrissey to rid themselves of his jilted lover once and for all. Under the guise of resurrecting their former relationship, Winthrop lured Curran to 279 Water Street on the evening of June 18th to celebrate what was to be the renewal of their romance. What he offered her as a celebratory beverage was a fiery concoction of equal parts alcohol and burning fluid. And as incredible as it may seem, so in love must Catherine have been, that she willingly drank what witnesses say were 3 quarts of this diabolical potion. Naturally, death ensued, and she expired within the walls of the tavern. But even a murder of such diabolical design occurring within his establishment left Thomas Norton unfazed and did little to slow the popularity of his incorrigible saloon. Instead, he continued undeterred in his quest to build a fortune by any means possible. In fact, Norton ran not one, but several brothels from the upper floors of his establishment, and the building was home to scores of society's most degenerate characters. Frank Moss, a crusading New York City reform attorney, even mentioned the site in his 1897 book, The American Metropolis. Citing Norton's brothel was a building filled with river pirates and hags. Norton's deplorable institution finally met its demise when the establishment was indicted as a disorderly house in April of 1879. The next decade saw a procession of saloon operators move in and out of the building, each to a varying degree of honor or dishonor, while a series of changes fell upon the neighborhood. The first major change occurred in 1883 with the completion of the Brooklyn Bridge, which now stood nearly atop a small structure, along with the sunshine that once embraced the building's silhouette. The bridge's construction also eradicated many of its competitors who stood directly in the path of demolition. 5 years later, the building's exterior was altered to its present-day form, which did away with the peaked roof in lieu of a flat-top 3-story structure designed by Kurtzer and Roll. The Victorianized facade included Eastlake-style window lintels and a modest cornice of minimal ornateness. The 1920s got off to a roaring start, but was soon to usher in the era of Prohibition. The property was leased by Charlie Brennan, a Brooklyn bootlegger who by all outward appearances was running a legitimate restaurant on the building's main floor. However, the basement was utilized for purposes of a more secretive nature, a place to serve hard cider and homemade beer. The ensuing decade saw the restaurant continuing to serve customers, when in 1979, Jack Weprin bought it from the McCormick family, renaming it the Bridge Cafe, maintaining the charm of its 1920s-era interior. The Weprins brought the historic establishment into the new millennium with the utmost care and diligence. Through the years, the establishment had become a favorite among many notables, including former New York City Mayor Ed Koch, who once declared it his favorite restaurant. Unfortunately, disaster struck the Bridge Cafe on October 29, 2012. As the storm cleared and damages assessed, the 220-year-old structure had 3 feet of water in the dining room and slightly more in the kitchen, while the basement that once had alcoholic beverages during Prohibition was completely submerged. All of the restaurant's ovens, stoves, refrigeration, and electrical components were destroyed. Even worse, engineers determined that the oldest wood frame structure in New York City would need 85 to 100% of the wood supports in the basement replaced. The estimated cost to repair the storm's damage to 279 Water Street was $300,000 to $400,000. A disheartening amount since the building was in flood zone A and carried no flood insurance. Sadly, the Bridge Cafe would never again open for business. The historic Bridge Cafe may be closed for business, but its heart beats as loudly as it had 231 years ago. This time as a fictional restaurant called The Black Rabbit for a Netflix series starring Jason Bateman and Jude Law the same name. And although its real-life counterpart may have been on life support for the prior 13 years, there is some hope for resuscitation after all. You see, in May 2025, Bridge Cafe NYC LLC was approved by Community Board 1 to once again operate a bar and restaurant from the premises. Here's to the next 2 centuries. If you like this content and would like to see more of the same, please click subscribe and feel free to leave me a comment if you have an infamous eatery you'd like to see covered.